Hello, Mark Sabatello with the Mastering MuseScore School here. In this video, I want to give a demonstration involving my arrangement of the hymn We Gather Together. For those of us in the United States, this is a very traditional Thanksgiving hymn, and it's approaching Thanksgiving as I write this. So I'm going to first play you the arrangement, and then I'm going to talk about it, talk about what was involved in putting it together, some of the things I did as far as the harmonies go, but also some choices as far as the arrangement of those harmonies. So, without further ado, let me just play the piece. It's not very long. All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. So now I want to talk some about how I put this thing together. People who have been following me and any of the demonstrations I've done or the compositions I've posted, you might realize this is fairly different. It's a little out of character for me in some ways, but in other ways it's very much me. So the ways that's different about it, the thing that I started from was this notion that um, I was going to write for a very particular type of ensemble that I basically never normally write before, which is a vocal ensemble involving female singers specifically, and then a guitar, bass, and drum, kind of a I'm thinking of this as like a country group, a country pop group, like I would sometimes hear if I happen to be catching. I don't like regularly watch like America's Got Talent or The Voice or anything like that, but sometimes if it like comes on right after the news, I'll catch a little bit of things, and I'm always intrigued by the groups that I hear in music like that and the kinds of harmonies they create. I mean, I've heard those kinds of groups a lot, but it was actually hearing someone on one of those TV shows recently that just really stuck in my head. And the thing that I heard them talking about in the little interview they did was that, oh, this just sort of came naturally to them. I think it was like a group of sisters. And they sing, they just naturally were able to find harmonies for songs. And that is a thing. I mean, I know that that is a skill in itself. And to me, it's actually pretty amazing that that this is something that people can do. Just find interesting triad harmonies. And so I'm very impressed by that skill, and I'm like interested to create music in that style. And yet there's this other part of me that says I don't want to just be about triads, right? I want to bring what I bring to the table, which is a slightly richer harmonic language than that. And I wanted to do it though in a way that kind of honored the tradition of that kind of country pop vibe of just having triads. So I don't know. I'm trying to get something that feels like that and yet uses a little more of my harmonic language without pushing the envelope past a breaking point. So that's kind of what I'm going for here. Also, I'm not a guitar player, but I wanted to feel like I was in this style, so I actually wrote the guitar part by thinking through the chord shapes. I mean, I'm not a guitar player, but I know how chords work on the guitar. And so I used, in some sense, standard chord shapes, these chord fret diagrams, but in some places I looked at the notes that would actually be involved in the standard fret diagram that I found by, like, Googling F sharp minor 7, and decided, you know what, that shape, I don't like how it arpeggiates. I forget if this was one of them, to be honest. So some of the shapes, though, I kind of came up with my own shape for, and then so that the arpeggio kind of did what I wanted it to do, voice leading wise. So I did some amount of that. So that's kind of the preface here. A final comment before I get into a lot of specifics is, when I'm creating a demonstration, very often it's going to be SATB, right? Soprano, alto, tenor, bass, because it's such a fundamental part of how we deal with music. Even if I'm writing a piano piece, I've got the melody in the soprano, I'm going to have bass notes, and I'm going to have my inner voices, and it translates to string quartet and other things. But here, I really wanted that female voice sound. And so I made a point to not write anything. I gave the altos some pretty low notes. It's an E below middle C, but plenty of altos can sing that. And I actually don't push that too much. And I also, if I were just creating a simple demonstration, I would just write that SATB and write the whole thing. I'd write like one verse SATB and call it done. But no, I know in this style, we're going to want passages where it's just one person singing, a solo. And because I love writing harmony, I actually wrote most of it in 3-part harmony, but I made a point not to do it all in 3-part harmony, right? I wanted different textures. So these are some of the things that I'm going for. And now I'm going to kind of break down for you now how I did this and how I actually reharmonized because I've got the original version over here, and then we'll flip back to it when we need to. So the first phrase, I wanted to start off with a solo. So first phrase, just a voice and the guitar. That feels totally in keeping with the style that I'm going for here. Now, when I bring in the next voice, I bring in a second voice first. So now we have 2 voices before I go to 3. When I bring in the second voice, I'm using a really common technique when you have only 2 voices. And this, I use it all the time in jazz, but it's really comes from other kinds of, it's a simple technique. And it's parallel sixths is what it is. It's parallel thirds, not even parallel. There's a third on the very first note, A to F sharp. But then immediately the second voice drops down to C sharp. So it's A to C sharp, sixths. And for here, for the next 4 bars, it's just parallel sixths. Right? Just sixths. And this works, and it totally fits. I put a G sharp on this note, and I'll come back to a little bit why. That's the only time I left the key. I should say also that I'm going out of my way to be more diatonic with this. I said that, triads are a big part of the style, and I'm probably including more sevenths than they would, they being the people who do this kind of music more regularly. But sevenths are a big part of my language, and I can't not use sevenths, although I do use way more triads than I otherwise would have. So I'm including sevenths, but I'm trying to keep things mostly diatonic. And when I do incorporate any chromaticism, I'm trying to be more judicious about it, because I want it to actually still sound like this style, not sound like, hey, I wrote a jazz piece. I only give myself like 4 measures where I'm like, I gotta have my stuff, right? So it's not even jazz, it's stuff that comes from classical music but filtered through my jazz sensibility. But it's all stuff that's been out there for hundreds of years. Anyhow, this passage here, there's only 4 chords there, right? We have the F sharp minor 7, then the B minor 7, and then we have our E7. Okay, I have E7 sus to E7, but it's still just 1 chord, right? E7 going to A. So 1 chord per measure, basically. The original right there was actually a bit different than that. Here's the original. That's what the original was like. And so in the original, this measure was not an F sharp minor 7, it was an A chord in first inversion, A chord with C sharp in the bass. Then what we had here was 2-5-1. in A. Right? We have an A chord here, and then immediately 2, 5, 1, 2, 5, 1. Well, that's a whole lot of A. That's really, in the second 4 bars there is A, 2, 5, 1, 2, 5, 1 in the key of A. That's too A-ish for me. I wasn't ready to really do that. I didn't want that much motion. I didn't want that much of a sense of, hey, we're in A now. That's not what I wanted to go for. By the way, this is, though, the G sharp. Now you can see where that G sharp's coming from, right? Because we are approaching an A chord. So I didn't want to start right off with an A chord. I didn't want to have that quick 2, 5, 1 here, because that's too much A for me. Instead, I slow that whole thing down, right? I'm going, in fact, let me switch to continuous view here so we can see this a little bit without scrolling so much. Instead of an A chord, I have F sharp minor. So and that lets me get to the B minor by the circle of fifths. In the key of A, that would be 6, and that would be 6 going to 2, going to 5, going to 1. So it's all circle of fifths here. So what I've done is taken what was 1, 2, 5, 1, 2, 5, 1, and I took all of that and simplified it to 6, 2, no, I'm in the wrong key. 6, 2, 5, 1. So just 3 beats of each chord, circle of fifths. Because to me, that feels very natural. Now the only issue that came up was the melody maybe fits it, maybe doesn't. So I mentioned these parallel sixths here, and the wonderful thing about parallel sixths is when the melody note is the root of the chord, a sixth below that is the third of the chord. That's going to sound great. If the melody, like it is here, is the third of the chord, then a sixth below it is going to be the fifth, and that's going to sound great. So those situations both work out great. Oh, here's a root in melody, and then the third as a sixth below. Here is the third in the melody, and then it's the fifth that's a sixth below. Well, when we have a fifth in the melody, which is pretty common, a sixth below that is going to be the seventh of the chord. So you have to be okay with sevenths if you're going to keep these parallel sixths. And I am okay with sevenths, right? I'm a jazz person. I use sevenths all the time. But here is where I introduced a seventh that I maybe didn't otherwise need, because it is where my parallel sixths brought me. I could have chosen to change this interval and maybe used an F sharp instead, had a fifth on it, or moved up to the C, moved to an A and had it be a third below that C sharp in the melody. I could have done those things, but no, I'm okay with that seventh, and so I let that be a seventh, and then I come back to a triad. So I still am keeping in that triad mentality. But the middle of this measure, boy, that measure there, my harmonization even really says 2, 5, 1, right? You can look at this D and F sharp. Well, that looks like the B minor chord without the B. This next note is E and G sharp. Well, that's definitely an E chord, right? And the last note of the measure, C sharp and E, that's 2/3 of an A chord. So that really would have fit perfectly the original harmonization, B, E, A. But one of the things that I have learned through experience is when you try to take a hymn arrangement that does chord changes really fast like that, and then you try to reproduce that in this setting with like an acoustic guitar trying to change chords 3 per measure, it doesn't translate very well. There might be some cases where you need it, but this wasn't one of them. This was one where I felt I can get away with this. I can get away with a situation in which really half the measure is all non-chord tones, right? The melody note, the E and the C sharp, the harmony notes, the G sharp and the E, none of those are chord tones over the B minor, but they're all within the key. And if you're thinking in these terms, it's actually in a B Dorian scale. So for people who think Dorian over minor, if you're familiar with that, well, that's all in keeping here. I should mention the G sharp. Well, it does go with the fact that we are moving to A. I could have left it BG. I didn't think of that originally, but let me try it now so you can hear this. like it, but I like the G sharp better, so I'm going to keep it the G sharp. So that's my B minor chord, and now over the E chord. Remember, the original had 2 beats of B minor, and I think maybe that was in deference to that A in the melody, thinking, oh, that A isn't going to fit an E chord very well. But it does if you make it an E sus chord, right? So that's what I did. I made it an E sus chord, so I don't have to hear the G sharp until beat 3. And then I'm okay with it. So the G sharp doesn't come in the accompaniment until beat 3, and then we're done with the A in the melody. Oh, and the 7th, again, because the melody note here is the 5th of the chord, a 6th below that is that 7th. And that's great, because in the key of A, 5 chords, that's the time when I'm most inclined to want a 7th. So now you might think, wow, that was a lot of work just for a really simple sounding thing. And well, there's an expression that's attributed to Thelonious Monk. I don't know what the attribution actually, when he allegedly said this, but simple ain't easy. Getting things to actually work well, getting simple things to work well is not easy. And I spent as long on those 4 measures as I did almost anything else in the piece. So I don't mind that I spent a long time telling you about it, because even when you're trying to write simple music, you can spend a lot of time thinking about that. But I would notice that this is the sort of thing that those singers who are doing their harmonies by ear, they probably would have just split into 6 and done this without a second thought. Maybe. Yeah, they very well might have. But in order for me to really look at what's going on and explain why it works and why it's okay to write this, I feel like it needed that kind of explanation. All right, so we're only 8 bars in, but I will try to move things along. So the next phrase is when I bring in the 3rd singer. But again, I'm trying to pace myself a little bit. I don't want to be into complete 3-part harmony in the sense of like each note harmonized, because that's its own sound that I was saving a little bit, and I'm trying not to get too far into that yet. So what I have here is that 3rd voice coming in with just an ah. Right? It's just basically the bass note. In fact, that is the original harmonization. It's right here. So it's the bass voice really is G, 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 F sharp, F sharp, F sharp, but it's enunciating each word. I chose to make it be an ah to have a different texture, so I could have a sustained note and only 2 notes moving. And I chose to have the middle voice move in quarter notes. Boom, boom, bum. Or what's the first note? Sorry, C sharp, E, A. While the melody goes A, ba-dum, with a dotted rhythm, so that there's some different rhythms happening. This is, some amount of that happens in that kind of country pop style. There's a lot of people moving together, but the idea that the voices might move independently happens some. And again, I'm trying to be judicious about this. Use it when it feels appropriate, and it felt appropriate here. And then I get into the just 2-5-1, which I think is pretty well exactly the original. Right, just 2-5-1. 2-5, but by the way, the melody note there is the 4th over that E minor chord. So the original had that really strong non-chord tone in it, just like I do. This wasn't really anything I did differently. It's just the specifics of maybe how I voiced it are a little bit different, but not much. This is that low E right off the bat. I don't know that singer has to get that low again in the entire piece. Maybe once or twice, I forget. All right, and then I want to go back to 2-part harmony, because I don't want to be 3-part all the way. In fact, I think I originally did, and then I changed my mind and deleted one. And I also decided, as long as I'm doing this, I'm going to let the middle voice have a little bit of a solo here. So it's not a solo, but again accompanied by just the ahs. And I did this, well, let me play it first. I did this as much as anything to give the lead soprano a voice, a rest, I mean, because otherwise the first soprano was going to be singing the entire piece, and that's not so good either. So I went out of my way to find an opportunity to give to create, one of the places where I have only two-part harmony, to have it involve the bottom two voices instead of the top two, or the top and the bottom. And so again, I go back to just the ahs. And here, the chords was G with a B in the bass, D with A in the bass, and I think those are the original chords. Let's see. It's actually an A chord in the next measure, and I changed that. But the G with the B in the bass was there, and then it went up to that A with a C sharp in the bass. And so I elected not. So I first of all changed that to a D with an A in the bass. So it's, instead of a one chord, it's instead of a five chord, it's one in second inversion, which is, it's a cadential thing. It's I wasn't ready to get to the five chord already, and so I like that 1-6-4 going to 5. I like that sound a lot, and the melody supported it, so I was like, yep, I'm doing it. And then I also didn't want, here I let that alto basically sing the bass part. But I didn't want it to be too much like that, and I like the idea of just this constant D. Sorry. D. I'm not singing a D. D. Sorry. D. Right, so I liked the simplicity of keeping that common tone, even though the intervals it gives me here is a fourth here and a fifth there. Neither of them were thirds or sixths, which are intervals I like, but I that was a choice I made. I decided that keeping that common tone was nice, and there is something about that fourth and fifth sound that feels country-ish to me, in some way that I can't define, so I'm not going to. To me, it feels right, though. That's all I can say. But I certainly could have put the note a sixth below that G would have been the B. I could have done that. And then a sixth below that A would have been a C sharp. That would have been the seventh on this chord, major seventh. Too jazzy, not ready for it. So I could have gone to an F sharp there, a third below the A. But no, to me, the D, keeping the D constant, was the smart choice. So again, I have this sus thing, and give me a chance and I will use a sus chord. I would say for that E chord, I don't remember if I made this observation, this wasn't gratuitous, right? I kind of needed the sus to support the A in the melody in this measure. I kind of needed the suspension. Here, I didn't need it, but it's such a part of my language and not just my language, it's part of the pop language as well. So to me, that's good. All right, so now finally, I'm ready to bring in the second verse and doing it in full three-part harmony with all three voices together. And so from here on out, there's less that I'm going to talk about with the voicing of things, more just about the chords themselves. So the original, of course, is all about the one chord. One, and then two. And yes, there's this little walking line in the bass. I like that walking line, and I used it, of course, in the guitar part, right? At the very beginning. That ding, 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 ding. So I like that line. I got to use it in the guitar, but I didn't use it, again, because I had other things in mind. I really wanted this passing diminished chord, because that's such a part of my language. So instead of staying on the D and then kind of walking up from the D to the F sharp and then coming down to E, I stayed on the D, but then put a D sharp diminished here. So I do actually have a little bit of a walking-ish line, D, E, in the second soprano. But I didn't choose to take it up to the F sharp. I actually could have. Let me play this line. So this, doo-da-dum, I could have gone with the F sharp there. And I think at one time I did. Let me try it. I actually like that at least as much, and so now I'm second guessing myself. Maybe I'm going to keep that. I don't know. Um, but one of the reasons I did is I really wanted the vocal parts to kind of work. If they needed, I wanted the vocal parts to describe the harmony as well as possible. And if I listen to just the vocal parts here, A, F sharp, C, that sounds too much like a C7 to me. I mean a D7, sorry. It sounds too much like a D7. It sounds, now it does literally, it's F sharp diminished, but somehow that D sharp was an important note. And yeah, it's in the bass, and I have the guitar. No, I don't have the guitar incorporating that note, and that might have been part of my thinking also, how I would have to voice that guitar chord to get the D sharp in there, and how that would have made the arpeggio pattern. So all those factors went into my head in choosing whether I was going to let that second soprano sing an F sharp, so I could have that dun, 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 sorry, D, E, F sharp, whether I could have that line, or whether I was better off with the D sharp. And when I did it that time, when I did it a couple days ago, I decided on D sharp. If I had it to do over again, maybe I'd pick F sharp. I don't know. Maybe I'd make different choices in how I did the guitar arpeggios and all. But in any case, that passing chord, D sharp, is the 7 chord in the key of E minor. All right, moving on. 2, 5, 1, right? And that's pretty much the original. Now, so that passage there, remember my previous version, where did I go? My previous version had F sharp minor for the full measure, then B minor for the full measure, and then E7 sus, which that isn't, and then the E7. Well, this version I decided to focus a little more on the B minor. So this time I did go ahead and let myself start, instead of with the F sharp minor, with the A chord. And I did this for some pretty good reasons, because I'm about to have this A sharp diminished chord, which is really F sharp 7. The bass has an F sharp. But based on how that arpeggio was working in the guitar, I felt it was going to be misleading to the guitar player to put an F sharp chord fret diagram there and then only ask them to play the notes of an A sharp diminished chord, because the A sharp diminished chord is the upper part of an F sharp 7. So in any case, I called it A sharp diminished, and the voices have an F sharp, A sharp diminished, right? There's A sharp, C sharp, and E. So it's really about that diminished chord. I just let the bass fill it out with the F sharp. So it's tonicizing this B minor. Oh, I'm looking at the wrong one, but it's the same thing twice, right? So this is the A sharp in question, tonicizing that B minor, and then I do it again. A sharp diminished, tonicizing B minor. And that is that passage where, again, it used to be this quick series of 2, 5, 1s, but now I'm tonicizing the B minor. So I could have gone with an F sharp minor at the beginning of that, like I did before. I would just have to change one note. And I could have, but I didn't. I decided I like that triad sound, the major triad sound, a little better in that context, rather than have F sharp minor followed by F sharp 7. I liked A major followed by F sharp 7. It felt, again, a little more in keeping with the basic triadic 1, 4, 5 starting point for this music, and the style of this sort of country pop thing that I'm paying homage to, even if I'm not staying totally within. But yeah, this tonicization of the B minor chord really gives it some extra beautiful color, I think. And then at the end of that measure, remember in the previous verse, when I got to that spot right here, I talked so much about how those were non-chord tones, that C sharp and E were non-chord tones over my B minor. Well, here I just go ahead and put in another diminished chord, so that now they're chord tones over that chord. I wasn't ready for that dense of a harmony yet. I wanted to just stretch that B minor for the first verse. But in the second verse, I go ahead and use this diminished chord to get me to the B minor. Because I'm coming back to B minor. I like that. I've tonicized that B minor. I kind of like hanging there for a minute, and it let this diminished chord work really well. But now when I come back to B minor, it's B minor 7, so it can start at 2-5-1. 5-1. And again with the sus, because I gotta have me some sus. All right, so this next passage, I'm keeping the same harmonization, A7 with G in the bass, D with F sharp in the bass, the same as in, that's what was there. And then a 2-5-1. Yeah, it's all very much like the original. But here I do one little thing that, again, I got to be me a little bit. It's a little bit of imitative counterpoint. So that's the first part, but the third part here comes in with the same thing a measure later. So it starts with right. So the first part goes so we get that imitative counterpoint. We get the first soprano singing so from the beginning, and then we get the alto singing so from the beginning. I wanted to try to do it with a third voice too, and I was going to see, if I start with a different interval, can I make it work? And the answer was no, I couldn't. I couldn't do it in a way I liked, but I made it be kind of, I don't know, a descending line, so that there's something still that feels contrapuntal about it. It's still entering a bar later. So that's my only little contrapuntal section there. So when I say couldn't make it work, the thing that worked nicely about this is when I entered with the so from the beginning at the same pitch level, it worked because it was an A, and A is a common tone. A is in that A7 over G chord, but the A now in the alto is in the D over F sharp chord. And I got really lucky that when I hit the high note there, the D, at this point the chord is E minor 7, and that's our 7th. So I got really lucky, and then coming down to A, yeah, that works over E minor 7. It's the 4th, and even the original had a 4th over a minor chord, remember? And it's about to become the root of the A7. So I feel totally, completely, absolutely, without a doubt, justified in doing that. Thought it worked out beautifully. There was no pitch that I could find to bring the second alto in on a measure later that made me as happy. And so yeah, I just gave it some notes. So it's going. So and here is I think one of my only major 7ths, and it's just a chromatically descending line here. It's a beautiful little line. I think country singers would be fine with that. So here again, I'm using this one chord in second inversion. It's the same place I used it the last time, but in the previous verse where I used that one chord in second inversion, I just let it sit there for the whole measure, right? So here it was just one chord, or 1-6-4 to 5 with a suspension to 1. So it was really simple, 1-6-4, 5-1. In this version here, I go a little more complicatedly. So I have my 1-6-4, and then instead of going right to 5, I do a little circle of fifths action here. I precede that 5 with a 2, and I precede that 2 with a 6. So I've got B, E, A, and then finally the D. And that B chord falls very nicely after the A in the bass. So I've got A in the bass, A, B, A. I can sing a low D, but a bass player could only play it if he detunes to it, which they very well might, right? I also let the alto voice have a passing A sharp. A sharp, B. I have that in the alto part, and I have that, so I have that here. And I have it in the arpeggiation. Boom, hum. And the voice leading doesn't work out where that A sharp gets to resolve to a B in the arpeggiation, but that's okay. It at least gets to resolve to B in the alto part. I could have had the bass reflect that also, but then, and in fact I did at one point. In fact, I could just make it be a dotted quarter, and then, so I could totally do that, right? That's totally good. But it actually works fine the way it was before. Let's listen. So I've established this half, quarter, half, quarter, half, mostly throughout the piece, and I have to ask myself, how often do I want to deviate from that just to get something work out slightly better with the chord? So I decided that wasn't one of the places where I wanted to deviate from them, so I left it at a half note. I think at one point, as I said, I had this as a quarter note. I had quarter, quarter, quarter. So A sharp, B, but then that A sharp in the bass clashed with the A in the alto. So I realized that by putting chord symbols, because that's right there on beat 2, and I realized by putting chord symbols in there, bass players will probably decide for themselves. You know, they'll come up with their own rhythms and things. They might not literally play half, quarter, half throughout, and that's fine. But at least for my scratch part here, my starting point part for a bass player to go from, I just gave him that half note. All right, so then I have that 2-5-1. So let me just play that final cadence there. All right, so now I have my biggest section. This is the section where harmony in this genre does something that's very foreign to my normal way of thinking, where the harmony part is above the melody. Now, people who live in that world might think I'm crazy to be saying this is foreign. Well, it's foreign to me, but it's all over pop music. It's all over folk music. It's all over that kind of country harmony kind of thing. The high harmony, the note above the melody. This is so much not a part of how we often harmonize things in a classical sense or in a jazz sense. We keep the harmony parts below the melody almost always. Maybe we'll have the low brass have a melody and then a whole chord thing happening above them, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about having parallel motion here, parallel thirds, parallel sixths, or some version of that, but with the melody below the harmony part, and it's just part of the genre. So I elected not to go with parallel harmonies here, and so here is where I think no one would have ever come up with this harmonization by ear. It really required me to think it through. But let's listen to what's going on here. So I'll take just that part there. So I have my D chord. That's all nice and simple, and it's a little 1-4-1, 1-4-1, a little implied 4 chord. Right, G, B, D, a little implied 4 chord happening there. 1-4-1, really a big part of this whole country pop kind of vibe. 1-4-1, and then I know I'm eventually going to want this 2-5-1, 2-5-1. But if I'm going to want a 2 chord, let's tonicize it, shall we? Let's give it a 5 chord. Let's give it the 5 chord in the key of E minor, so B7. Now, the melody note, though, is... No, not the melody note. Sorry, the melody note is A. A, G. So that A is the 7th of that B chord, so that totally works. And it's in keeping. Remember, the previous version, I had a diminished chord there, which is really serving the same function, D sharp diminished. But here, I'm actually calling it B7 and putting a B in the bass. And this time, there is a D sharp explicitly there in the alto. And then the melody has C, which is the flatted 9th on that B7. So this feels very jazzy. But again, I swear Bach did this too. It's just not such a part of the country language, but I don't care. Gotta be me. And now, as long as I have that B there, I'm feeling like there's this way of setting up that B. And realistically, I could have made it actually be a C7. Let me add a B flat in here so you can hear the sound of that. I'm going to add a B flat. So this B flat to B, listen to the sound of that. B flat, B, B flat, B. That B flat is, if I spelt it as A sharp, would have been an augmented sixth. This is an augmented sixth chord. But then I would say I chickened out. No, I didn't chicken out. I just decided there was no place for that B flat. Jazz person would call that a tritone substitution, by the way. We would say this was C7 leading to B7, and C7 substituting for F sharp 7. So if you're familiar with tritone substitutions, that's what that's about. A classical person would say, oh no, that's an augmented sixth chord. That A sharp is an augmented sixth above the C. Either way, it's a nice sound, but it just didn't fit my voice leading. There was no way to work it in there other than just by randomly giving it to the guitar, and it just wasn't in the cards. And so I had to, that was one of the hardest decisions that I had to make in this piece, was giving up that A sharp or B flat, because I wanted it. I really wanted it, but I felt like it pushed it a little too far. I feel like now everything is like, listen to the soprano line. It's a nice line. It's nice and chromatic. After the D to the C is a whole step. C to the B is chromatic, chromatic, chromatic. So it's all linear, chromatic, and the melody is just what it is, and the harmony part, again, it's nice and chromatic. So it all feels, and it's all in one direction, just going down chromatically. And I liked that the soprano 1 went down on beat 2, and then it repeats that note from beat 2 to beat 3, but the alto changes from beat 2 to beat 3. And then they both change going into the downbeat, but then on that chord, the alto keeps the same pitch while the first soprano goes down. So we have this at no point do both of those two keep the same note. Once we hit this measure anyhow. Here, well actually even here, at no point do they both keep the same note. So it's moving at all times. And to me, that was really kind of an important part of this, now that I've taken the guitar out of the equation, broken down the drums to something a little simpler. Realistically, a real drummer might break it down even more. And they might have done something a little more elaborate for the previous section. And then within my 2-5-1, I borrowed a little minor key. So I couldn't resist that B flat here. That B flat borrowed from the key of D minor. It makes my 2 chord into a half diminished 2 chord, which is just a lovely sound borrowed from D minor. Now, going on. So again, I want to tonicize this B minor like I did the previous chord, but I'm giving it an F sharp 7 to tonicize it, and this time I am doing, this time I was able to convince myself it was okay, voice leading wise, to actually have G7 to F sharp 7 to B minor. In other words, this G7 here is that same chord I talked about before. It is the augmented sixth chord, or tritone substitution, for C sharp 7. C sharp 7 would have tonicized the F sharp nicely. G7 is a tritone sub for it, or in classical terms, from the G in the bass to E sharp in the second soprano is an augmented sixth, and then it resolves really nicely. So here, the voice leading worked out really nicely, where I got to actually use that augmented sixth chord. And it's only an eighth note. It's only an eighth note. Could have just heard it as a passing tone or whatever, but it pleased me greatly to be able to work that in there. It's the kind of subtle detail that makes me really happy when I can make it happen, which is why I was really disappointed when I couldn't make it work in other places where it might have been more prominent. So this is like one of those little inside. No, it's not a joke. It's an Easter egg. I don't know. It's a little present for people who are really paying attention and listening and know their language here. Well, from here on, it's simpler again. It's more like my first version. It's just the B minor and then E7 sus to E7 to A with another bit of sus. And here, I love the way that voicing, that suspension worked in the alto. For some reason, it's just especially beautiful to me. Listen to that. I just loved how that worked. For some reason, hearing it in that octave made me especially happy. So, and again, another suspension on the 5 chord, because I can. All right, we're into the home stretch finally. And in the home stretch here, I wanted a little bit of show off here. And here, again, I'm having to go against a little bit of my better judgment that says there's something a little cheesy about what I'm doing. But again, now it feels like part of the style, right? And so I'm just asking the soprano to sing some high notes and wail and get the cheap applause. But it's good. It's good stuff. Yeah, okay, it sounds awful when I do it, but can't you just hear like a really good, pure angelic voice soprano singing that line an octave higher than I just did? That would have been so beautiful. And all that's happening underneath that is just thirds and sixths. I start off from A down to C sharp is sixth below, and then at various places I switch, like now it's a third below, C sharp to A. It's actually a third and an octave. I've actually opened up my voicing wider, because as that soprano is getting higher and higher, I figured it needed to be balanced by a lower alto. So I let the alto go a bit lower here. And then I changed my mind. Now, it's not that I changed my mind. I'm just thinking about the voice leading here. I'm trying to fill out the chord, because this E in the high soprano and then that melody note is C sharp. I need there to be an A, and I don't want this. I don't want that alto to have to jump up to the A, so I come down to the A. But now to fill out the next chord, I feel like I need the third. I've got the D here in the second soprano, and I got nothing in the first soprano on the first beat. So I want to hear the third, so I'm giving the alto the F sharp. And I could have tried to do it in the upper octave, but it felt like I didn't want that alto to have to make that big leap from A to F sharp. So I went and brought it down. And so that opened up the voicing with sort of a side benefit. So I'm trying to balance those things, trying to keep the alto part from being too jumpy, and I decided it was okay to leap here, because I just did. Decided that leap was going to be okay. Felt natural to me. I kind of sang through it a couple times to see what I liked, and then that all felt okay. And again, it's all just based on making sure that at all times I've got all three chord tones represented. Or in the case of this A7 chord, when the soprano is singing G, I want to make sure I have the root and third represented. So when the melody note is the root, the harmony part is the third. And later on I decide, well, I've already heard the root, that's all the root I'm going to hear, and so now I'm just making sure I'm hearing the third and the fifth. The third and the fifth here, and then the fifth and the third here. And so I'm hearing that against the G in the soprano. And so I've already heard the A at the beginning of the measure. The guitar is played in A. I feel like I've heard enough A. Maybe. I suppose I could, and I hear the A on the beat there in the alto part. So I feel like I've given it enough A. So that part right there. So I reach that final climax of that high A, and then just a real quick, and that's on the D chord, right? And then a real quick D7 to G to go to the 4 chord there. Thy name be ever praised. And that in the original is also a G chord, but a G chord in first inversion, and that's because the bass is doing a particular thing. Well, in my case, I no longer need that. I no longer need the bass to do that because the rhythm section is about to drop off. So I just go ahead and put in a root position, and so that's what I did. 2, 5, 1 in G, not 2, just 5 to 1 in G. It's really 1 to 4, but you know, tonicizing the G here. So I put that G in root position rather than inversion like it had been other places because I'm coming to a stopping point here. I could have still used first inversion, but that's just the choice I made. That's the kind of thing I think about. And then at the end here, this is just pretty, that's all just very diatonic stuff within the G. And again, now the soprano, they're in 3-part harmony with the soprano 1 on top of the melody. The melody is in the middle. Right, so I've got that going on. And here again, I'm using the same technique I did before. I'm tonicizing a B minor chord. B, D, sorry, is that a B, D, F sharp, B, D, F sharp. It's a B minor chord. And I'm tonicizing it with this basically A sharp diminished chord. It starts off as just an A triad, and then by the middle of the measure, it's an A sharp diminished triad. And by putting that little, I get to hear an F sharp too, so it really implies an F sharp 7 chord. And those little da-da-dums, I figure anyone singing this thing is probably going to figure out other places where they can throw in some of those little ornaments on their own. And so I've tonicized that B minor, and now finally I have another 2, 5, 1, 2. Oh, no, not a 5. That's basically E, G, B, right? So this is my 2 chord. And then, what do I have here? One of my very favorite chords, right? G, B flat, D, minor 4. Yeah, I could have actually kept this D as an E here. No, because that's the melody note. That's why I didn't. I thought about changing that to an E, and then I would have kind of a half diminished chord happening here. But no, the melody note was the E, and I didn't have enough voices to make a half diminished chord. You need 4 voices, and I didn't have them. And just the way the voice leading worked, I couldn't make it happen any other way. So I was happy with it this way. It's basically a minor 4 chord, which I love. And you know, I can't go this long into a piece. Well, I went this long without a minor 4 chord, and by God, I'm going to have my minor 4 chord because gotta have it. Well, that is quite the journey, but that's the kind of thinking that I put into this piece, the kinds of things that I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about voice leading, I'm thinking about circle of fifths, I'm thinking about uses of borrowed chords and diminished chords, I'm thinking about all that stuff, thinking about the doubling of notes, I'm thinking about all this stuff, but I'm also trying to think about what's being true to the genre that I'm trying to write within, but also thinking about how I can be true to myself, feel like I'm writing in that genre while bringing in more of my own language. So with all of that said, I'm just going to play it one more time, and maybe we can listen to it with a new appreciation for what went into creating something like this. All right, so there you have it again. Now that you've heard me explain all the stuff that went into it, hopefully it didn't lessen your enjoyment of it. Hopefully it just made you appreciate some of the things that maybe you missed the first time around. So I hope you learned something from this demonstration, and all the concepts that I talk about here, all the voice leading concepts, all the voicing concepts, all the harmonization concepts that I talk about are covered in great detail in my online course, Harmony and Chord Progressions. So if you want to learn more about what I'm talking about when I use these terms, learn more about how you can use them, by all means, I encourage you to check out the course.